Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Gillespie. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of JWJI, I'd like to welcome you to this week's Race and Difference Colloquium. JWJI and Emory University acknowledge the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. In 1821, 15 years before Emory's founding, the Muskogee were forced to relinquish this land. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory seeks to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to respectful stewardship of the land. Before we begin today's colloquium, I do want to remind you of some events that are coming up in the next week or so. So on Friday, along with Emory College, we are hosting a First Fridays at 4 session with Emory faculty who are presenting work on race. This month, our speaker is Dr. Pearl Dow, who holds a joint position in Emory College and Oxford College. So she's going to be talking about Black women in politics. We hope that you can come to that. Also be on the lookout next week. We're going to have an event with our colleagues in Latinx studies on migration and health. So we hope that you can come to that as well. Today, we have the honor of having Dr. Rafael Ocasio with us today. Dr. Ocasio is the Charles A. Dana Professor of Spanish at Agnes College, just down the road from us in Decatur. He's the author of 2 books on dissident writer Reinaldo Arenas, Cuba's Political Sexual Outlaw, which was published in 2003, and The Making of a Gay Activist, which was published in 2007, both by the University Press of Florida. He's also the author of A Bristol, Rhode Island and Matanzas Cuban Slavery Connection, The Diary of George Howe, which was published last year and of which he's going to be speaking of today. Newly published books include Race and Nation in Puerto Rican Folklore, Franz Boas and John Alden Mason in Puerto Rico, which was published last year, and Folk Stories from the Hills of Puerto Rico, also entitled Cuentos Folclóricos de las Montañas de Puerto Rico, which was published this year by Rutgers University Press. Next year, he has a book coming out called The Dissidents of Reinaldo Arenas, Queering Literature, Politics, and the Activist Curriculum, which he co-authored with Sandro Barros and Angela Willis. And so that will be coming out next year from the University Press of Florida. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ocasio to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Rhonda Patrick and Antoinette Burrell for organizing this event. I'm truly honored to address fellows and staff of Emory University's the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference. Thank you for your invitation. I am going to share my screen. This presentation highlights my book, A Bristol, Rhode Island and Matanzas, Cuba, Slavery Connection, The Diary of George Howe, which focuses on the rise of the province of Matanzas in the early part of the 19th century as an important buyer in the US fuel slave trade and a notable place of business investment for New Englanders. I will provide a historical background of the relatively unexplored yet tremendously profitable connection between Cuba and Rhode Island as part of a complex circum-Atlantic slavery trade. In particular, US citizens from Bristol were owners of sugarcane and coffee plantations in the province of Matanzas. New England-based businesses, including the importation of food, clothing, and modern machinery, to just name a few, supported the operation of sugarcane plantations in Cuba. Sugar production was, at its core, at the center of the illegal slavery trade. My critical focus is, however, a literary and cultural-based analysis of a work diary produced by a Bristolian writer, George Howe, who documented his experiences as supervisor of Havana New Hope, a Bristolian-owned sugarcane plantation in the province of Matanzas. As an outstanding example of a hybrid plantation narrative, I will highlight examples of the ways in which Howe's work diary reflects upon cultural practices as he observed them, some of which he celebrated in his drawings and in various types of literary formats, inspired by his many tasks as a sugarcane plantation administrator. In particular, I will underscore a speech written in celebration of the inauguration of a steam sawmill whose construction Howe had supervised. With his festive and pro-American speech, Howe establishes the utilitarian tone of his work while acknowledging that its installation initiated a groundbreaking technological phase for Ingenio New Hope. The building of the sawmill was also an inspiration for a literary piece and an occasion to express his solidarity with his fellow co-workers who, like him, were working under strenuous physical circumstances. Within a narrative that celebrated a modern and consequently more productive sugarcane plantation under US managerial practices, Howe also frequently made positive statements about enslaved individuals whom he underscored as tireless field workers. To that effect, Howe produced a full body color portrait of Peter, Ingenio New Hope's enslaved cook, who, according to several diary entries, had become a constant presence in Howe's long work days. Howe's portrait of Peter is an extraordinary artistic physical rendition in which he clearly avoided the stereotypical depictions of enslaved workers so common in Cuban popular art forms. I will suggest ways in which Howe attempted to communicate more than a sympathetic view of such an iconic Black worker whose literal role as a sugarcane plantation's nourisher is extended to boldly present Peter as a friend. Following a 1791 revolution fueled by enslaved workers that led in 1804 to Haiti's independence and its fall as the world's largest producer of sugar, Rhode Island investors became increasingly financially interested in Cuba as an emerging global sugar producer powerhouse. Bristol-based men might have also seen themselves as pioneers, paving the way for financial expansion into Cuba, which, although under Spanish colonial jurisdiction, had attracted the attention of US politicians as a territory for prospective annexation. Indeed, Cuban plantation owners developed intricate international commercial networks, including their association with foreign investors, who in turn played an important role in transforming the island into the world's largest producer of sugar. One Bristolian businessman turned politician was James de Wolfe, 1764-1837, remembered today as, quote, the largest slave trader in the history of the United States, end of quote. At the time of his election to the Senate for the state of Rhode Island in 1820, de Wolfe was, quote, a naturalized landowner, end of quote, in Cuba, a legal status that since 1790 allowed US citizens ownership of Cuban plantations. Senator de Wolfe owned several sugarcane and coffee plantations in the province of Matanzas. Cuban sugar plantations, known as ingenios, were heavily dependent on the laborious work of enslaved African field workers. Also, after a 1790 sugar boom in Cuba, also after 1790, a sugar boom in Cuba had started to replace tobacco as a major international export, replaced by refined sugar imported by supported by US and British technology. Finally, as a congressional senator, de Wolfe is reputed to have lobbied for the eventual Monroe Doctrine, 1823, which gave the United States free access to international markets and allowed for loopholes for the ongoing illegal slavery trade. My primary source of literary and cultural analysis is a text with a rather curious title: The Diary with Letters, Lubrications, Dreams, Flim-Flams, Cogitations, Whims, and Fantasies of the Author, 1832-1835, an extraordinary collection of essays, poems, speeches, and drawings by George Howe, Esquire, 1791, 1837. Not much is known today about Howe, but his most unique trait was his nature of his relationship with James the Wolf. Howe was the Wolf's nephew on his mother's side. Howe's scholarly background was, however, vastly different from the traditional individual called to serve as administrators of plantations. He had graduated from Middlebury College, and as his diary entries reflect, he had extensive knowledge of classical and US literatures. Indeed, he also had literary aspirations. In his diary entries, he celebrated the publication of his articles in the Bristol Gazette. He also had a strong interest in languages, quoting often verbatim in Latin, and at the end of his stay in Cuba, he was able to write considerably lengthy and rather complex diary entries in Spanish. As a manager of Ingenio New Hope, one of Senator De Wolf's sugarcane plantations in the province of Matanzas, Howe kept a detailed documentation of his work responsibilities. He also documented his enjoyment and also his suffering of the natural elements of an extremely rural wilderness found literally within walking distance of the physical boundaries of Ingenio New Hope. He had come to Cuba intending to produce a whimsically titled diary collection for which he also drew color and black and white portraits and sketches of items and people found at Ingenio New Hope. These drawings were meant as visual aids to his most striking literary pieces. Howe wrote extensively about the underpinnings of Cuban plantation practices as he witnessed them at Ingenio New Hope from May 1832 to February 1834. His detailed descriptions of Ingenio New Hope's work crew, both white and enslaved individuals, constitute today a significant documentation of the operation of Bristolian-owned sugar mills in the province of Matanzas. He not only had serious literary aspirations, but the carefully orchestrated formatting of diary entries and drawings implied his desire to produce a document worthy of publication. Thus, Howe wrote outside the functional constrictions of the traditional financial plantation diary, weaving in labor reportage and even the entertaining elements of trendy travelogues that so many US Americans visiting sugarcane plantations produced throughout the early part of the 19th century. Howe placed Ingenio New Hope as the main stage for his multi-genre plantation diary entries, describing select details about his supervisorial role in the plantation's operation. Ingenio New Hope was located in the wilderness of the province of Matanzas. At some 171 kilometers from Key West, Matanzas' port rivaled Havana's harbor with a similarly privileged geography, well placed to provide easy access to southern ports of the United States. In the early 19th century, the virginal wilderness of the province of Matanzas became home to some of Cuba's most notable sugarcane plantations, quote, the richest monocultural sugar producing zone in the world and a center of African slavery, end of quote. Sugarcane produced in Cuban plantations was an integral part of a shrewd transatlantic financial arrangement uniting commercial enterprises with a booming and illegal international slavery trade. Bristolian-owned sugarcane plantations in the province of Matanzas produced molasses taken to Bristol to be refined into rum. Behind this operation, which took place in rum refineries also owned by the Wolf, was yet another connection with the ongoing illegal slavery trade. Known as Guinea rum, it was used as a bargaining chip in the purchase of African enslaved workers who were sold in turn in Cuban and US southern slave markets. Howe was part of a long line of Bristolian administrators, including trade workers such as builders, masons, and carpenters who worked on the Wolf-owned Cuban plantations. Through his family connection as nephew of the Wolf, Howe would have been conversant in the illegal schemes that allowed his uncle for a profitable slave trade. Thus, it is not surprising that the most glaring omission in Howe's diary was the disclosure of any type of information about the Wolf's underground slave trade operating in spite of anti-slavery trade regulations, beginning with the 1807 US Congressional Act prohibiting importation of slaves. Slave trading survived. In fact, it flourished. However, as Maria Hinojosa has pointed out, quote, perhaps we should call it what it is, an international government-sponsored human trafficking ring. It was sanctioned forced migration that humanized and stoked hatred toward Black bodies in order to justify the labor force driving America's economy, end of quote. Positioning himself as a hardworking administrator, Howe's narrative line underscores his struggles to run Ingenio New Hope efficiently, in part because of the lack of support from the Wolf, who barely invested in the maintenance of the plantation and the well-being of the crew. As I came to experience, a dynamic plot takes the readers through Howe's multiple work tasks, mainly his dealings with workers, Black and white, and other individuals living nearby Ingenio New Hope. There is one character clearly left out from most of Howe's work entries, though, James the Wolf. Senator de Wolf remains as an absentee plantation owner in the tradition of wealthy plantation owners who prefer to live in fanciful homes in urban centers. The heavy and dirty work of managing plantations was in the hands of various types of administrators, including the hated overseer, who was also in charge of administering punishment methods to underperforming or rebellious enslaved workers. In August 1832, 3 months after his arrival in the province of Matanzas, Howe wrote a speech delivered to an all-male crowd of workers at Ingenio New Hope, which included enslaved workers. A notable absence in a celebratory speech about the prospective financial gains of the sawmill was any reference that the Wolf not only owned the Ingenio, but that the sawmill was a project that the Wolf had presumably orchestrated. In the United States, formal speeches were pedagogical tools and part of, quote, a popular lecture system, end of quote, and a strong tradition in Bristol, even today, particularly in celebration of official acts during the 4th of July. Within the context of proselytism, it is extraordinary that Howe referenced enslaved workers several times, addressing them directly as workers in the construction of a sawmill whose operation he had come to supervise. The true center of this exultant speech is, of course, the sawmill, which Howe praised as yet one example of the triumph of modern US inventions over the wild forces of nature surrounding Ingenio New Hope. An accompanying drawing highlights the towering structure as standing out against the wooded El Monte, or the natural surroundings of Ingenio New Hope, suggesting its eventual control over the uncivilized background. The sawmill was indeed a magnificent invention. As Howe bragged, it was, quote, the triumph of genius over untamed nature, end of quote. The inauguration of the sawmill was a significant historical occasion, and Howe made the man responsible for a task that had been deemed impossible. Quote, you have this day reared in the land of imbecility and ignorance, a proud monument to American skills, industry, and enterprise, end of quote. Thus, The sawmill became for Howe a symbol of US entrepreneurship flaunted in the face of the Spanish colonial power that he considered terribly inefficient in its financial management of such a blessed territory. But Howe also admired the wonders of El Monte, inspired by these exuberant tropical sites, and with the eye of a pseudo-natural scientist, Howe wrote nature sketches that closely document the diversity of flora and fauna found nearby in New Hope. He also drew multiple nature-inspired artistic sketches, detailed drawings produced in black and white and in color. Other written diary entries record the deeply felt positive impact of his frequent walks while discovering the natural wonders. These escapes were his only resource to deal with his increasingly depressive state of mind. In a heightened sense of bewilderment, his harsh physical condition these escapes were his only resource to deal with his increasingly depressive state of mind. In a heightened sense of bewilderment, his visual documentation of the Cuban natural wonders sustained Howe mentally and even spiritually from the harsh conditions that he came to experience while operating in New Hope. He also faced dangerous weather conditions and fought tropical diseases, cholera in particular, that had killed considerable number of people, white and enslaved workers in the province of Matanzas in the 1830s. The clear protagonists of the speech were the workers whose Herculean efforts brought to completion the Bristolian designed sawmill, among them the enslaved workers. The representation of enslaved workers went beyond the voyeuristic passing depiction of individuals engaged in forced field activities, as US visitors often documented in their travelogues. Although Howe physically kept enslaved workers in the field, he awarded them a strikingly sympathetic image that served as an unusual positive introduction. Quote, "Our ebony friends who roll their billiard balls in wonder as the work advances and show their rows of ivory, give happy demonstrations of health and cheerfulness, end of quote. In this characterization of African ebony field workers, Howe certainly drew from stereotypical physical depictions so common in Cuban and US American popular art forms. However, he also described them as exceptional workers in spite of their exhausting agrarian tasks. Quote, "I am at loss to imagine how with none but these poor Negroes, insulated from the arts and from all intelligent society, subject to inclement skies, subject to diseases, subject to other positive evils, and to innumerable privations, he could so soon have laid low the dark forest and tamed the features of the landscape," end of quote. Although the embedded reference to Washington Irving might have been an early indication that Howe intended to reduce the harsh elements associated with rural slavery into literary components, it is more significant that the scene was constructed as a rather abolitionist statement. Quote, it is very remarkable that amidst all these labors and suffering, his people have been generally contented. Still more remarkable that death has claimed but one, end of quote. Of notable importance was Howe's determined effort not to label enslaved workers as such. He called them by various epithets, people in this case, never as slaves or by any racial slur. More significantly, Howe referred to enslaved workers by their names, a practice that was uncommon among Cuban plantation owners. He also frequently documented his interaction with enslaved workers. In fact, not only did he spend time with them as their supervisor, but he sought their sole company while ignoring white workers. His references to enslaved workers were written stating their names, while white workers appear without much information, not even bothering to name them, often referring to them by their national origin. Thus, having established a sympathetic recording of enslaved workers, Howe underscored one of them with a rather peculiar mode of introduction. He drew Peter, Ingenio New Hope's cook, in a full-body color portrait. The somber-looking drawing also serves as a formal introduction to a poem written in honor of Peter. The drawing is certainly outstanding because it reproduces Peter's physical disability. As Howe stressed in his description to a dear reader, he renders him a tragic figure. Quote, Peter, the while on rainbow legs, stalks around and ever and anon, as fair occasion serves, breathes in the smoothie ear of some dark angel, the tender plaint of unrequited love, end of quote. Yet, Howe made no reference to the physiological cause of Peter's rainbow legs, a condition that did not seem to have stopped Peter from performing his duties as cook. The intended reader of Howe's poem was left to imagine the actual cause of his physical disability. This terrible condition had been documented, however, in Cuba since 1798 among enslaved workers. Henry de Montt, in his compared study of anthropology and pathology of Black Cubans, published in 1872, succinctly observed this condition, which stunted the development of the knees in individuals as young as 6 years old, who, quote, are forced to carry without having acquired sufficient strength, heavy baskets full of sugarcane, bagasse, etc. Howe's artistic portrait of Peter is bold, devoid of any representational objects related to his condition, as Ingenio New Hope's cook, simply dressed in long pants, shirtless. Peter's outfit in no way reveals his condition as cook, as Howe clearly avoided placing Peter in the kitchen. Departing from conventions of a plantation work sketch, the background is merely a white wall and glaringly missing any depictions of Peter's cooking tools. Indeed, readers of Howe's diary would wonder about absence of any of Peter's tropical dishes that Howe often bragged about. One of them, funche, a sort of thick polenta or grits, was a common side dish for both white and enslaved workers that Howe often mentioned because of its insipid taste. A comparison between Peter's portrait and Howe's self-portrait, which depicts Howe as a busy writer, further brings to the forefront Howe's avoidance of objectifying icons easily associated with a sugarcane plantation, and most specifically, Peter's task as a cook and enslaved worker. His self-portrait, Howe's self-portrait, underscores his role as a writer, busily writing in a Spartan-looking bedroom, barely fit for the needs of a gentleman, as his formal attire suggests. The emphasis on fanciful clothing was too premeditated, I think. Howe literally rejected the trappings of the traditional outfits of the Cuban countryside, closely associated with other supervisorial figures, such as the dreaded mayoral or overseer. Other individuals with such colorful clothing were local peasants with whom Howe had extensive contact, as denoted in frequent diary entries. In his figure drawing, Howe fully intended for his viewer to see Peter beyond his role as a cook. Howe was influenced by cheaply made reproductions of popular Cuban and US art depicting slavery scenes at sugarcane and coffee plantations. In the case of Cuba, these representations exclusively provided either flattering visual glimpses of the buildings or stereotypical depictions of enslaved workers. Sugarcane ingenios as powerful economic institutions were highly protected. A strong political censorship kept artistic and literary representation deemed to have an abolitionist sentiment at bay. Indeed, if published at the time of its conception, the portrait of Peter, placed as an enclosure of a poem dedicated to Peter, written on February 24, 1834, would have been groundbreaking. According to Cuban art critic Jesus Guanche, today's known portrait of an enslaved worker on a sugarcane plantation belongs to Swedish writer Frederica Bremer, 1801-1865, who after a trip to Cuba in 1854 published a travelogue. Two of her pencil drawings, Carlo, the man from the Congo, and Cecilia, the Black female slave of James Bale's family in Matanzas, Guanche categorically describes as the first two portraits of enslaved workers. As in the case of Howe, the portraits are outstanding because of their positive depiction of these individuals, whose physical traits were not only normalized, but literally became the face of slavery. After a 1 year, 10 month stay at Ingenio New Hope, Howe hastily left for Bristol. He wrote no diary entry about a farewell with Peter, whose storyline ended as anonymously as that of thousands of field workers who dutifully worked the sugar fields in the province of Matanzas. Although their deaths were seldom memorialized in Cuban historical accounts, the awful ways in which enslaved workers died, mainly as the result of work-related accidents, was the subject of a booming underground abolitionist literature operating in the province of Matanzas. In my estimation, Howe was well aware of this underground literary production. Strangely, Howe made no regretful expressions of leaving behind the exuberant scenery that nurtured him and that had inspired some of his most colorful landscape paintings, nor did he indicate packing souvenirs for his wife or his little girls, who were eagerly expecting his prompt return. Indeed, the deplorable conditions experienced at Ingenio New Hope eventually contributed to an increasingly dark state of mind. Signs of severe mental depression that could only be cured by his return to Bristol characterizes the defeated tone of his final diary entries. Howe died on October 27, 1837, in Bristol, Rhode Island, one day after an accident while boarding ship bound to Haiti. He had been named U.S. commercial agent at Cap Haitien to the Le Cap. No records of his final resting place exist, nor is it known how his wife, his widow, and 5 daughters financially survived. The widow reported that at the time of her husband's death, his estate was worth $81.37. 2 months later, on December 21st, Howe's notorious uncle, Senator DeWolf, died as the second richest man in the United States. Howe's manuscript, the diary with letters, lubrications, dreams, flim-flams, cogitations, whims, and fantasies of the author was never published. Today, it still remains literally unknown at the Bristol Historical and Preservation Society at Bristol, Rhode Island. The legacy of Senator DeWolf, as celebrated in the quaint Bristol historical downtown quarters, is nothing like what Howe experienced, I fell to it as I joyfully celebrated at the Wolf Tavern, even though previously I had felt disappointed that in their display there were several artifacts related to the refining of rum in Bristol without any indication that the so-called Guinea rum was used in bartering in the trading of African enslaved workers. Nonetheless, I fully enjoyed a rum libation, which, if memory serves me right, was made with Bristolian rum. I should have taken a cue from Howe, who never, not even once, mentioned having consumed rum, either Rhode Island or Cuban produced. I closed my presentation with two examples that illustrate how our country still today struggle with the trope of plantations as workplaces that operated by means of oppressive, racialized work practices and endorsed by the law. Indeed, my chosen example contrasts two images of plantations reflective of an opposite range of emotions. First, I stress former President George W. Bush's plainly xenophobic statement while lamenting the invasion of the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, which he characterized as a rather horrific event, one only previously experienced only in so-called, quote, banana republics, end of quote. As the son of Puerto Rican peasants who worked on such US-owned banana and sugarcane plantations, I can only wonder whether President Bush purposely ignored the frequently imposed financial arrangements that allowed for the existence of such US-owned plantations on my native island and elsewhere throughout Central American countries. But I have chosen for you a more positive statement about the role of plantations in our state, in our state of Georgia, one that I believe need no critical commentary on my part. I leave you with the newly elected Senator Raphael Warnock's public acknowledgement of his personal connection with plantations as site with a continued socio-economic impact on regional US politics. Quote, these are Senator Warnock's triumphant words upon his historical election as the state of Georgia's first Black senator on January 6, 2021. Quote, the other day, because this is America, the 82-year-old hands that used to pick somebody else's cotton went to the polls and picked her youngest son to be a United States senator. End of quote. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. As Rhonda has noted in the chat, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom center of your Zoom screen, and write a question, and I will be happy to read it for you. So we have one question already from Jorge Felipe Gonzalez, who asks, was Howe actively involved in the emerging Cuban-based transatlantic slave trade? If that was the case, who were his trading partners in Havana and Matanzas?
The way that Senator DeWolf managed to do this, there were several agents, both based in Havana and Matanzas, in the province of Matanzas. Howe himself, I don't know if he was involved. I will say no, given the fact that he clearly expressed abolitionist sentiments in his diary. But of course, he was the nephew of James DeWolf, so he was covering his tracks as well. So it's one of the, for me as a writer, and I should stress that I am no historian, so for me as a non-trained historian looking at this history in order for me to explain the literary context of the diary was very difficult. But as I said, and I didn't mention either that he comes across as a very religious person. Not that it doesn't mean that a religious person at that point was heavily involved in the slavery trade. But that is a very good question. Thank you.
Again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat while we wait for some more questions. I'm struck at the end with your invocation of Senator Warnock that we often forget sort of how the slave trade was intimately tied to colonialism and how it was international. I mean, if we think about it, when we think about, you know, routes for sugar and cotton and other types of goods, but what kinds of connections do you think people whose research and scholarship tends to be more US focused, what can we learn by always making sure that we are including the Caribbean in our discussions of slavery?
That's a very good question. I think what I would suggest for new researchers is to look into the close relationship that existed among abolitionists, both in the United States and in Cuba, which is my area. But as you know, as I mentioned in passing, I'm Puerto Rican, so I know that there was also a very strong abolitionist movement in Puerto Rico. So the connections through this transatlantic or circumatlantic, as I often call it, is very strong. In my book, I suggest heavily that Howe knew about the abolitionist movement that was taking place in Matanzas. Some of the abolitionist leaders had been and were also plantation owners. And these plantation owners had a very close relationship with Americans. I didn't make my case very clear in this presentation, but Howe was not an exception as one who wrote a diary about a plantation. Americans flocked Cuba, Havana, and Matanzas throughout the 19th century. So there are dozens of plantation diaries or travelogues in which plantations are very central to the description of what they saw. Including the description of enslaved workers and their work. They are very clean. I have yet to see a commercial travelogue that brings the ugly side of work on a plantation, on a sugarcane plantation. In my presentation, I didn't make it clear, but hopefully it came across that working on a sugarcane then and today is hell. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It's not easy. It's not easy work. Yeah. For various reasons.
Yeah. Henry Kahn asks, is it possible that the grounds of the Hope Plantation have been described in modern Cuba? So if history, ownerships, confiscations, collectivizations, etc., can be documented, it would make an interesting book or movie. Perhaps the existence of Howe's diary should be shared with Cuban intellectuals and artists.
I would love for that to happen. Actually, there is a movement in Cuba now, as I don't know if you know, but many of the sugarcane plantations have been put to rest, mainly because Cuba is not now the sugarcane producer of the West. So many of these plantations now are being turned into museums. They're being turned into sort of recreational parks. And the movement is for the history of the plantations to be more known. I would love to see a book by a historian that traces the development of these sugarcane and coffee plantations owned by Bristolians. And if you're interested, if you're looking for for a subject for dissertation book or an article, the people at the Bristol Historical Society are extremely easy to work with. There are several other diaries. There are several other entries, mainly financial records of various other plantations in the province of Matanzas. I will welcome you, or I will encourage you to go to Bristol. You will thank me later. It's very easy to do research with them. Plus, the city of Bristol is beautiful. Mm. Go in the summer, though.
Nicholas Bloom asks, could you elaborate a bit more on how you see Howe's writings forwarding an abolitionist agenda? I appreciate your close reading of Howe's more humanizing portraits of enslaved people, but it seems to me that his descriptions also fall a bit into the happy, contented slave trope, which slave owners often used to justify slavery.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I would have loved to start researching, but I didn't have the stamina to get into the development of abolitionism in the United States. I know for a fact that Rhode Island was among the first states to develop a heavy, sort of heavy abolitionist stance, and we're talking about early 19th century. I would have loved to see how some of these Bristolians were, I guess what I'm trying to say, I would have loved to see what some of these Bristolians were reading or had read prior to their trip to Matanzas. Also, I'm very interested in the abolitionist movement in Cuba, which was as strong as it was in New England at the beginning of the 19th century. In fact, Cubans claim that the first abolitionist novel to be written in the Americas, including the United States, was a Cuban novel, not an American novel as we usually think about. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. That was an area that I did not have the expertise. So what I filled in, my lack of expertise on abolitionism, I filled in with the type of literature that the Cuban government allowed, depicting enslaved workers on sugarcane plantations. And as you mentioned, it's literally exactly what you're pointing out. It's a very whitewashed, no pun intended, literature that made these sugarcane plantations as the central staging for modernity, literally.
Thank you. Again, if you have more questions, please feel free to add them in the Q&A. I want to ask a question again about connections and thinking about sort of this kind of transnational knowledge of what's going on. I have to admit, I didn't know this until I went on an Emory sponsored trip to Cuba about 5 years ago, but how did people in the United States know, if they knew anything about the 1825 slave revolt that took place in Matanzas, was led by a woman?
Yeah, you're right.
So how does that fit into this larger discussion?
Well, not only that, and I can't remember your name, the fellow who's working on religious practices. It also has a very strong connection with African-based practices. That one particular rebellion by enslaved workers. And actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think one of the Bristolian men who went to Cuba in that time period references that rebellion. You know, it's a very interesting question, because even in Cuba, that rebellion is not very well known. Usually, when it comes to rebellions in the popular imagery of the Cuban, everybody thinks of the stuff that took place in Havana.
Hmm.
But that's a very good question. I had not thought about it before.
I mean, it's really interesting just
Yes.
having gone to the site where it happened. There's a big monument there.
Yes. You're right.
Yeah,
You're
there are
right.
all of these, yeah. And
And
then also in Havana, you can see sort of the places about sort of like what, I don't think we realize what it takes to make sugar. And so aside from
Oh,
the, like,
no.
see the implements, it's just like, oh, wow, that's
Yes.
really hard work
Yes. Yeah.
involved.
Also related to that rebellion, there are two facts that are interesting. Right after that rebellion, the Cuban plantation owners decided that they were not going to be allowing the individual cabins for enslaved workers. So they came up with the idea of, like, it looks like a warehouse, literally. There are very few windows, and everybody was locked up at night. The structure is even called today barracón, which is literally a barrack, and it's a word that we still use in the 21st century. So that's one thing that came out of that rebellion. And the second one is that it also marks the beginning of large runaway slave, what is the word? Groups, villages, and they were very fierce. These places in Matanzas.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, I have another question. An anonymous attendee asks, were there any findings regarding slaves who became literate and left traces of their experiences in diaries, writings, sketches, etc.?
So in Cuba, there are only two. One was written by a poet while he was an enslaved worker, but he was an enslaved worker in the city of Havana. So most of his documentation is about his labor as a urban city dweller, working under several mean women owners. The second one is a very interesting one, and I drew heavily from it in my filling in the silences left behind by Howe. This is a, I'm sorry, I'm gonna put on my, there's a dog around.
No problem.
In 1963, a sociologist interviewed at that time a 101 man who had been a runaway slave, actually, but he spent his childhood and part of his youth year as a slave working on a sugarcane plantation. And that is the only testimony that we have. However, this testimonial has been very contested because Montejo is his name. He never wrote. It was a series of interviews by this sociologist. His last name is Barnett. And eventually Barnett put together what we call today the biography of a runaway slave.
Great, thank you. Jorge Felipe Gonzalez asks, could you please mention some examples of the abolitionist movement in Cuba, which you just classified as strong as the one in New England? I find your assertion puzzling and fascinating because as I understood it, the abolitionist movement in Cuba was weak and almost non-existent. Cecilia, for example, was not published on the island.
Yes, Cecilia Valdez was published in New York, but Suarez, his last name is Suarez y Romero, was writing actually around the same time that Howe was in Cuba, a series of short essays And he wrote them in such a way that these essays passed the censorship. He also wrote an abolitionist novel. It's called Francisco, also around the same time that left the island with a British abolitionist. I think his last name is Maddox. And along with that abolitionist novel went the testimonial written by Manzano, the urban enslaved worker. Maddox translated Manzano's biography, but Suarez y Romero's Francisco, the novel, was not translated. There are several abolitionist pieces, literary abolitionist pieces that were never published, particularly those by the author of Cecilia Valdez. Although Cecilia Valdez had a short story version that was published in Cuba in a journal, also around the same time that Howe was in Cuba.
So I don't see any other questions. I'll give everybody a couple seconds if you have more questions. But seeing none, I want to thank Dr. Ocasio for a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I also want to remind you of our upcoming activities. So of course, on Friday, we have our First Fridays at 4 event with Dr. Pearl Dow. So please feel free to sign up for that webinar. And next week's colloquium is going to be Dr. Zakia Luna from Washington University in St. Louis. And so she's going to be talking about reproductive justice. So again, thank you for being with us today. We hope that you come back next week, and we hope that you have a great week. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And please feel free to email me if you want to continue this conversation. I would love to hear from you.
Thank you. We will do that. Thanks so much.